we are actually an independent think tank that is based in Singapore. So we are a registered nonprofit organization in Singapore. We don't take funds from government or any organizations, and we are not part of the National University of Singapore. So that's to make it clear. So what we do, we're looking at building the enabling, we call it enabling ecosystem for energy transition. So essentially what we're really doing is that the part of energy transition is a think tank. We work with government on policy development, strategies, net zero goals. CSER came from a group of energy modelers. So we look at long-term scenarios. So that's where the work on the so-called the thinking part, right? And we call us think and do tank. The do is where we work with the companies, right? Solution developers, in some sense, research performers to look at new innovative solutions that are nationally appropriate to be deployed in different countries. By and large, our focus is Asia Pacific, but mostly on the emerging economies. We have experts represented across around 15 countries. We cover Asia, Europe, and North America. We would like to cover Africa. I think we're talking to some partners that are based in Africa. Hopefully one will have the representation soon. We have representative office in Japan and one in China, which is actually the Technopreneurship Incubation Center. Now, after the advertisement, here's the main thing. So 4 charts to begin with. I'm going to give you the regional perspective. I mean, you heard from EDPR on the potentials of renewable development, which is very encouraging. So I'm going to give you the other side of the picture. I really want to talk about the reality in this region, right? So in energy transition, there is always the notion about we're transitioning to a 100% clean energy world. So the final destination is everybody understood. Let's go to a renewable clean energy world, no fossil fuel. But very often we don't talk about where we are transitioning from, right? Industrialization, we didn't discover renewable energy during industrialization. We discovered coal and we invented steam engine. And that's the fundamentals of our energy market, our energy economy, our geopolitics. Right? So that's where we are, fossil-dominated economy. And in Southeast Asia, what's even more interesting is that if you look at our energy balance, we as a region are still a net energy exporter. That means we are exporting energy to the outside world, gas in particular. But the thing is, if you look at the 3 main fossil fuel that we are running, oil, gas, and coal, I don't know whether you can actually see it. So in terms of oil, we are still we are already net importer, but we are net exporter of coal. We are also a net exporter of gas. But in the climate change argument, the enemy is coal. So the moment we get rid of coal, guess what happened? We have to buy a lot of gas, and we will quickly become a net gas importer. So that means collectively we'll have an energy security problem. And this is a trend that we're going. We are already becoming a net gas importer soon. So is coal the enemy, or is coal the fundamental survival of energy security? And so, because we know that there's challenge, we're working on the alternatives. Right? Renewable energy is by and large one that we're really looking at. Singapore, well, we would love to see a wind turbine, but it's probably not going to work. Right? So solar energy is really the only thing that we're scaling up. Pertamina, the man holding that bottle of diesel, actually that's biodiesel. So Pertamina also has an initiative to look at whether existing refinery can actually produce biodiesel using biofeedstock. And the state of Sarawak in Malaysia has already completed a hydrogen ecosystem. So from production using hydropower in their hydro dams to delivery, on-site storage and distribution and refueling, the city of Kuching is running 3 hydrogen buses. I think by now the number has risen up to 5, right? And then Laos wants to become the regional power bank, green power bank. So bring hydropower across the region. We talk about the regional grid in a minute. And then there you have Vietnam. Interesting case about Vietnam is that they actually have a huge amount of offshore wind, but and the wind turbines are there for, I think, at least a few years before they can bring the wind energy to the grid. One simple reason is they don't have the infrastructure to accommodate the intermittency of wind energy. And make a guess, what is this? In the Philippines. That's a nuclear power plant. So, from now, when you walk out of this room, never say Southeast Asia doesn't have a nuclear power plant. We do have a nuclear power plant. It is fully constructed, fully commissioned, but it was never operated. So at the point of completion, just rewind back to history, look at what happened in the Philippines, and you understand why the nuclear power plant never went into operation. But the interesting fact is that This is borrowing from my friend from PNRI, Philippine Nuclear Research Institute. This is not from me. Don't quote me. This is the only nuclear power plant in the world you can go inside and take a selfie. You wouldn't be able to do that in any other plant. This is the one you can do it. And this is a Westinghouse 600 megawatt class, at the time the state of the art. Now, talk about reality. And more reality is going to come. So we do have huge renewable potential. So by now we're talking about thousands of gigawatts of potential in solar and wind. But having access to fund, addressing the grid intermittency, those are all the issues that needs to be addressed. Right? Financing really is an issue in the region. Although we understand the economics of renewable energy. We understand you can produce cheap, affordable, clean electricity. But the question is, who's going to pay to build that project and infrastructure? And so countries are going into nuclear. So there should be more. So there are few countries. I think the next one is the correct one. Yes. So this is what is happening right now in Southeast Asia. Some countries have made plans, official announcement on timeline of building first of a kind in the country. Others are looking at studying the feasibility. Singapore is one of the countries looking at the feasibility of the different nuclear power plant technologies. So, of course, when it comes to climate change, there is the life cycle carbon footprint argument. This is, I'm not going to really argue with any one of you about, whether nuclear energy is like this or that or whatever. But generally accepted, this is the IPCC chart, not mine. It is generally agreed that nuclear energy would have a much lower carbon footprint as compared to fossil fuel. And it is a baseload technology. So you will be able to decarbonize your energy system when it comes into operation. So we took a bold question. Can nuclear power plant work in Singapore? Not technically, but from an economic standpoint. With our load profile and our demand, would nuclear energy really make sense? So 2017 study, we did a pure levelized cost of electricity assessment. So just assuming that this plant is going to operate 24/7 and assuming a gas price, coal price, whatever, and then what is really the cost of electricity generation back then. And we took first of a kind large reactor cost in Singapore, first of a kind SMR assumption in Singapore. And it turned out, well, the cost per kilowatt might be quite high for SMR and reasonably speaking nuclear. But if you come to levelized cost for electricity, nuclear energy can still be very cost competitive, even in the Singapore context. So then we progressed the study to 2019. It was published in 2020. So we're looking at combining heat and power. So in today's context, we call that power to X operations. So we say if you want to allow operate a nuclear power plant by load following is probably impossible. This nuclear plant can only vary maybe around 10%. But if you say let's just assume that we do a load following operation. When there is peak demand, you go on full load. When the demand is low, you use the excess electricity to produce hydrogen or store them in energy batteries. So and then we did a combined levelized cost of electricity study. We took a typical floating nuclear power plant. You will get an idea which floating one we took for reference. We took an HTRPM, which is a generation 4, the high temperature gas cooled reactor pebble bed module, a typical generation 3, and a typical generation 3 plus. All 4 examples are in commercial operations. You will have an idea of the examples. And then we did a further assessment 2022 to look at, so this is actually a bold assumption. When we look at this replacement study, so you looking at fossil fuel replacement, not net zero, not zero emissions. We just look at fossil fuel replacement. What is the cost of replacing fossil fuel? And what is the cost benchmark for nuclear to make sense in the context of Southeast Asia in the different countries? So we come up with a cost benchmark for each country. And then also we come up with a generic analysis to see whether nuclear indeed is cost competitive. So this is a combination of a large reactor, small modular reactor. Rather, we didn't really differentiate the size. You just look at the cost per kilowatt, at which level it will make sense for Southeast Asia to adopt. And even though we found nuclear is cost competitive, you may or may not be surprised to know that we didn't even account for the grid cost for renewable integration. We didn't account for grid upgrade infrastructure investment. We didn't account for energy storage. So if you bring those in, well, it's going to get expensive. So that's my argument about having proper financing in order for us to have access to that. So of course, SMRs, just to put in context, what does it mean by SMR? So we're actually looking for things that's generate 300 megawatt and below that will qualify as a small modular reactor. This is the IEA definition. And there could be micro reactors in which, today in the context of data center or, captive plant in the industrial parks, we're actually looking at micro plant that might be able to further reduce the security parameters or safety radius to just within the plant facility so that you really have a co-location. So the HTRPM, later I will show you in the picture. Some of the technologies, SMRs, these belongs to what we call the generation 4. So what it means is that if you consider generation 1 as prototype, shipping port, Carrier Hall, those things in the early days is just to prove the point the nuclear works. Those are first generation in the 50s, 60s. Then come to generation 2, which is the commercially proven. Most of the light water reactors operating in the world today, 400 of them over units. Generation 3 is, some people call it after Fukushima, safety enhancement, economic optimization, passive safety. Those are large, and some are SMRs. When it comes to Gen 4, they're supposed to have inherent safety, meaning even if there's an accident scenario, you leave it there, it will not cause any harm. There won't be any accident as you've seen in Fukushima. And in fact, the nuclear power plant will just stay there for the rest of its days. But in reality, actually, what we're looking at is 7 days of no accident scenario. So meaning, if it's in terms of station blackout, you can leave the reactor there for 7 days, and you will not have a hydrogen explosion. But after 7 days, I guess nobody really ran the simulation what really happens. But no matter what it is, modularity, that's as with all SMRs, that's what we try to achieve. And some of these big powerhouse, AI powerhouse data center, they're already signing deals with nuclear startups. You'll be wondering, nuclear startups, can you really deliver? But then again, if you look at who's behind the startups and what they're really working on, you actually get the sense that some of this technology or some of these ventures might actually be more promising than the traditional powerhouse of Westinghouse or Hitachi, right? Because they are the ones that's really pushing the technology to the market, rather than sitting there waiting and say, hey, who wants to come and order, and then we go through a 10-year program with you, and then buying you for the next 100 years. These guys are saying, well, if you want to come to us in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to deliver the reactor for you. We hope they hold their promise. And maybe they will. If you look at the global competition of SMRs, including floating nuclear reactors, try to count how many designs there are. And in fact, this is outdated already. There are more designs coming up. So in terms of competition, in terms of diversification, the kind of technologies that's being developed worldwide, competition is heating up. And it looks promising, right? And the more competitions, it drives down the cost and drives up the innovation, brings the supply chain more ready. But look at the reality. As of today, there are only 2 SMRs in commercial operation. One in Russia, it's a floating nuclear power plant. The only other one is the HTRPM in China. And if you look at this, of course, you can't tell the size of the building, but this is easily 10 times smaller than the typical nuclear power plant. So you can actually place this plant within the hydrogen production facility. So that's the study that we did. So let me rewind back to that study a little bit. So when we look at the co-generation of hydrogen, first of a kind reactor, first of a kind hydrogen production facility, we're looking at a hydrogen production cost of somewhere between $2 to $5 per kilogram. So that was our assessment. Without any, that was just the assumption that we made. Anyway, back here, you would say that, okay, this is too new, right? The first one, the Russian one was 2020, the Chinese one is 2021. You would say, well, this is not the kind of technology that we can adopt. It's way too new. But hang on a second. There is a floating nuclear power plant that was operating in the world. You probably don't really know that. In 1961, Second Warship Sturgis was converted into a floating nuclear power plant in Panama Canal. So essentially, that's the submarine nuclear reactor that is converted into producing power for that particular place. And so that's actually the first non-commercial, I would say, floating nuclear power plant in the world. And so we do have a tremendous amount of history or experience in operating floating and SMRs. And now, could it be the time of fusion, right? We will say, well, fusion is very promising, give it another 30 years. So another 30 years is 2055. Well, 5 years beyond our 2050 commitment, it's not too bad, right? By accident, if it does come alive, maybe this is really the future of energy. And by the way, the sun is up there. That's the giant fusion reactor in space. So it does work, but can we make it work on the Earth? But yes, we do have amazing breakthroughs that's been announced over the past just the last couple of years. And in fact, in Singapore, we're actually working on nuclear fusion research. And then just towards the end, I want to just explain about our work, specifically on the Johor Singapore Special Economic Zone. And what is interesting is that, first of all, location-wise is interesting. This is a place that's right across the causeway, bring convenience to both countries. And what is even more interesting is if you look at the industrial setup, this is a place that's dominated by heavy industries. And then high-tech companies are also moving in, right? There's also data centers that's moving into Malaysia, looking for cheaper electricity, especially. And so the demand is going to go up. Where we took a special interest is look at, first of all, there's the renewable energy potential. There may be the cross-border opportunities for Singapore and Malaysia to share power. And then could nuclear be one of the options to support that? And our argument is that this is actually maybe the beginning of a cross-border nuclear cooperation between Singapore and Malaysia, using the interconnector that's already existing, which has around 700 megawatt or 800 megawatt in excess remaining capacity. There may be more interconnectors that could be built to support nuclear energy development. And we do have example, the cross-border nuclear plant in Slovenia and Croatia. There's also another example in China in the old days. That's the Diabei plant between mainland China and Hong Kong. It's very similar ownership structure model and very similar power sharing model. So we could actually consider a nuclear power plant just next door, right? So if our front yard can accommodate it, there's definitely a backyard. So then I wouldn't want to bore you with this ecosystem concept that we're doing. Essentially, what we're working on is if floating nuclear could support future floating industrial parks out at sea, then we can really bring in the clean chemicals, clean fuel to the international export market directly without borders. So that's always the idea, innovation without borders, and this is fuel without borders. And we are hoping that this will bring G2G or even G2B collaborations on the infrastructure in international water. And in fact, deployment in international water of nuclear infrastructure might actually be easier than deployment in territorial water if the country doesn't have a nuclear safety regulation in place yet. Now, whatever we want to do, to our belief, is the ecosystem approach. We need to have the kind of ecosystems. There needs to be buy-in from the government, from the industry, and more importantly, from the public. So public confidence has to be there first. Whether you talk about renewable, you talk about nuclear, you talk about any infrastructure, even CCUS. Lots of environmental organizations today still don't believe CCS is a way to decarbonize. It's still a way of greenwashing, right? That's what most people believe. But would it actually work? It might. It just depends on how you demonstrate compliance, how you make sure that the CO2 does stay underground in the case of CCS, and making sure your plant is properly designed and operated in the case of nuclear. And then from then onwards, think about how do you design or implement future-proof policies. So if you're interested in learning more about CCR or about what we're working on, feel free to get in touch with us.